used or experimented with Salvia divinorum regularly for a period of months. I would do it once a week pretty much. And yeah, my experiences, it finally took me to a place when I combined the use of marijuana with salvia, as in smoked salvia while I was already um, open from smoking marijuana. That took me to a place that I wasn't really ready to go to, you might say, which is kind of it's like
Yes, indeed, yeah.
it's like I was talking about with Jake Cotts. You know, you only find out what's enough by finding out what's more than enough. But I left Salvia alone after that. Basically, I haven't been back to it since then because I felt like that I don't know about learned everything it had to teach me, but that it was going to take me a long time to process and fully
And
understand.
what were your findings and your sort of conclusions about it? You know, because you're an articulate guy, it might be good to hear your thoughts on it too.
Well, it's certainly an area where my ability to articulate begins to fail me. I have to say, with Salvia Divinorum, I was,
Yeah, it's very state specific, isn't it?
yeah, it really does test one's abilities to describe or explain or express experience because it takes one. See, my experience was not that it took me out of myself, but that it took me deeper into myself. And I did experience entities, but not in the DMT sense of a visual um,
Mm.
encounter with entities that were outside of oneself. On the contrary, it was non-visual, first of all. I mean, there was a visual element to it, but that was definitely just, it felt as though I was sort of translating an experience that was beyond the sensory into terms that I could understand, including certain visual impressions, colors and shapes. But essentially, it was definitely non-sensory. And yeah, the experience I had repeatedly, and it was like each time I smoked it picked up on the last time in a sense, and I was back in this place and back with these beings, and each time was this incredible sense of recognition and familiarity as I let go of the fear, because there was always a great deal of fear before smoking, of
Yes.
having to let go and lose control. And then as I let go of that, as I let go of the fear, and then I found myself once again in this realm, and I remembered that there was nothing to fear here. On the contrary, that this was my true natural state. And but how I interpreted it, perhaps not during, because there wasn't really a rational faculty operating during to speak of, but afterwards coming out of it, my understanding was that I was actually interacting as consciousness with the molecules of my physical body, and that these molecules were living entities who were communicating with
Mm.
me through singing and laughter, and that they were um, essentially that I was remembering that I was a collective, that I was a collective of intelligences, all interacting, and that my personal ego self was illusory, and that once I let go of it, I entered into this sort of fractal wonderland of electric ecstasy, uh, which was completely annihilating, but at the same time completely liberating. So that yeah.
I was just going to say that the interesting thing about, well, if you just take your description, if you just snapshot that description you just gave,
Mm,
it makes me wonder what happens to the psyche of a 13-year-old Californian girl
mm,
if she does that and experiences that self same thing, but doesn't have the state of mind and doesn't have the serenity to process that.
mhm,
So going back to your original question, it depends, of course, on your processes and your state of mind and the amount of work you've put into developing and clarifying and deepening yourself.
mhm,
So, not from some kind of esoteric Gnostic perspective, just from becoming at peace with yourself. So, I'm sure that any sort of psychonautic explorer will be familiar with set and setting and so on. And for me, what precedes that always is my own peace. And from day to day, we get a sense of these things in ourselves. And some day you wake up and you know that it's not the day. And other days you may
mm,
be unpeaceful but full of joy and happiness, but quite vulnerable in a way. So I think it becomes obvious as you become more in tune with your experiences, that some days are better than others, and they seem to be relatively random, and you may be able to get astrological pointers, but it's almost like a kind of biorhythm, and you can chart these things and say this is a good 3 days for me to do this. After that, I'm going to have to wait 20 days.
Hmm.
That's what I've found.
Right. Well, I never really wanted to smoke salvia. That was the thing, and it baffles my mind that it's become recreational. I find that almost
Hmm.
incomprehensible because
It's not really recreational, is it now?
well, no, and it's essentially there's something terrifying about that complete loss of control. But I suppose, as you're saying, if people haven't gone into that deeper, subtler realm of being already, then they're not relinquishing control. They're actually trying to handle the experience and use it in a way that is recreational. And I think that the toll that that takes is probably um, extreme. I mean, for example, uh, the period that I'm describing. I was, as I say, using it every week for several months, and during that period there was a
Wow.
um, yeah, I don't know how many times in total, but maybe 20 times in a short period I would have smoked it until that final time that convinced me that that was enough. But during that period I visited a dentist and had my teeth cleaned and everything else, and then uh, I actually was suffering teeth problems about 2 months later, and so pain or what have you. And so I went back to another dentist, and he told me that I had 6 cavities that needed filling. And I told him I had just seen a dentist 2 months ago, and he'd given me a complete makeover, checkover. And so how was it possible that I had developed 6 cavities during a period of 2 months? And he told me straight out that that wasn't possible. He simply didn't believe me. And I can only deduce from that, seeing as it doesn't stand to reason that the previous dentist wouldn't have noticed those cavities. I suppose it's possible that that second dentist was lying and actually giving me cavities when I didn't need them, but I didn't get that sense. So I got what it's led me to think about salvia and maybe all-powerful psychedelics is that because they speed up consciousness, in a sense they speed up time. I think they release energy in the body, a kundalini energy, or however you want to describe that, and so we get flooded with that release of energy into our conscious minds, and then it's a question of how much can we process it during that very brief period of time in which it's being released. Of course, most of it we can't. It's just too much. It's an overload. So a lot of that energy just gets lost. It's this big explosion, and that energy is coming from the body. I think it's energy that's being tapped in the cells of the body, and so it's as if we've actually, when we smoke salvia or DMT, it's as if we actually literally take a trip to another dimension, and encounter the realities and the energies therein, and then we return to our regular time stream with a certain amount of memory of those experiences. But it's like a trip to fairyland. You could go to fairyland, you think you've only been there a day, and you come back and everyone you know is dead. In 100 years you
Yeah,
come
yeah. I
back.
think in one of my postings, the way I write at my blog is instead of doing kind of lots of short posts, which is the usual blogging method and what it's really all about, I really use my blog as a website and put one or two larger pieces on a month.
Hmm.
And one of them recently has dealt with the theme of temporality. And I have this kind of shorthand for various things which might pop out during this discussion. But one of them is the 3D and the 4D. This being the 3D world, and the 4D being where you were introduced to through altered states. And the way I see it, that when you're in the 3D, you are in the temporal, you are in time, in the linear, and the physical manifestation, the density undergoes um, the apparent process of change over that period of time. And because consciousness is expressed locally, one goes along with that linear thing, along the train track from birth to death. When the mind exits that, naturally during sleep at night, where I believe DMT flashes are probably quite a natural occurrence, and as anybody who kind of follows this stuff will be aware that DMT is pretty naturally occurring all over the place.
Hmm.
The difference with sleep, however, is that an amnesic response